reference to UGTT, and I've written about this, there seems to be, it has to decide between its immediate, what it sees its immediate social economic sort of base and interests versus national interests. And it's really sort of operating within a framework that has most to do with the economy and the interest of its membership, which is very different from its role during the first national dialogue that led to an agreement on the framework for politics. It's playing a very different role, and that's perhaps unfortunate. Whether that will change, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, it has to somehow, to some extent, to echo what you said, a powerful movement like UGTT has to decide, who its worst enemy is, and on that basis, also sort of decide where it stands. And for now, we don't necessarily see this. So, Radwan, with that further happy remark, I will ask you to jump in and offer us your thoughts as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Dan. Thank you, Khalil, Dan, and the Arab Center of Washington, D.C. for inviting me to be on this webinar today. It's a great pleasure to be speaking right after my friends, Dan, Ambassador Wallace, and of course, the one and only Monica Marks. So I'm happy to be here with you. I will not bore everyone to death by stating or repeating what has happened in Tunisia over the last 10 months since last July. I will simply tell you what happened just in the last week, just few days really, to show you how dangerous the situation is and how rapidly and quickly it's moving towards a full-scale dictatorship, and how Qais Said has been dismantling the state and the democratic institutions every day, day by day, for 10 months. As you know, last week, the Council of Europe's Venice Commission issued a report condemning the planned referendum on a new constitution and saying that it was both illegal and unconstitutional. If you have not read this report by the Venice Commission, I urge you to read it. It's available online, and it's really, really very detailed analysis of how everything that Qais Said has been doing since July is both illegal and unconstitutional. Please read this report. It's very detailed. But just as mentioned, the few of the last recommendations of this commission. In the last section, it says the commission considers that before any constitutional referendum, legislative elections should be organized as soon as possible in order to restore the existence of parliamentary power, which has disappeared since the suspension and subsequent dissolution of the assembly. If the electoral law is to be amended before the parliamentary elections, a broad consultation of political forces and civil society should be conducted in order to reach a consensus on the new electoral rules. The elections should be organized by the EZ in its composition prior to Decree Law number 22. And finally, the Venice Commission is of the opinion that the repeal of Decree Law number 22 is essential for the legitimacy and credibility of any electoral or referendum process. So it's a very, very strong language and very strong position that the Commission has taken, basically declaring that everything that Qais Said and what he's planning to do over the next 6 months is really unconstitutional and illegal, and does not create a credible process for elections or for the referendum. Of course, this has caused a very angry response from Qais Said, who considered the report as interference in Tunisia's domestic affairs, forgetting that Tunisia was a member of the Venice Commission and that Tunisia had asked the Venice Commission opinion on what has been happening throughout the last 10 years to help Tunisia move toward democracy. And then he declared all the members of the Venice Commission as persona non grata. So this happened just basically 4 or 5 days ago. Again, last night, after midnight, Tunis time, Qais Said issued 3 decrees, not 1, but 3 decrees in the official journal, announcing the firing of 57 judges. 57 of the top judges in Tunisia were fired last night, which he does not have the right to do. The president does not have the right to fire judges under Tunisian constitution or under Tunisian law. And also announced in the decrees that he will be amending the law on the High Judicial Council, that he created a new law just 3 months ago, but for him it was not enough to control the High Judicial Council. He wants to amend it now to give himself more control over the High Judicial Council. And also the electoral law, that he will be amending the electoral law without any consultation, without any dialogue with anybody. He will be amending the electoral law in very flagrant contradictions of the laws and constitution of Tunisia and the basic pillars of democratic governance. So if it was not clear or evident immediately after July 25 that this was a coup, I think that what happened after July 25, he initially announced that he will be operating within the legal framework and operating with total respect for the constitution of Tunisia. This is what he said. Remember, he used Article 80 of the constitution to justify what he did on July 25. And we all thought that it was a temporary thing for 1 month. The discussion was whether the parliament was going to be reopened in 1 month or 2 months. Remember, in August, that was the discussion. I think now, in the last 10 months, it has become very clear that it was indeed a coup against democracy. So this is really, really sad, not only for me, but for all Tunisians who have been working for decades, really, to build real democracy in the Arab world. You know, it's a lot of work and effort that has been going into building a democratic country and a democratic society and a democratic system in the Arab world. It was not easy. It was very, very difficult. And nobody said that Tunisia was a perfect democracy. It was still work in progress. Of course, there were shortcomings, there were weaknesses, there were mistakes made in the last 10 years. Of course, you know, this is not an easy process. And we have to learn from those mistakes, and we can improve our democracy. But we do not improve our democracy by going back to dictatorship, or by canceling the constitution, or by having a president who controls everything without any checks and balances. So, unfortunately, Qais Said has used the cover of the pandemic and has used the health and economic and political crisis, which he helped to create since 2019, since he became president in 2019. He used this crisis to launch a coup against democracy. Now he's preparing this referendum on July 25, which on a constitution which nobody knows what is in this constitution. He appointed a commission of the deans of the schools of law in Tunisia, led by one of the former deans. But all the deans, current deans, have rejected this appointment and have said, no, we're not going to participate. So right now, this commission really has only one person, Sadiq Bel'eid. He's the only one who we know is a member of this commission that is going to write this constitution. I mean, he's talking to people on a one-on-one basis, inviting them for discussions, but we have no idea who is in this commission that is tasked with writing a new constitution. He, of course, refused the national dialogue. He said, I will do a dialogue only with those who agree with me, only with those who support the July 25 coup or initiative or whatever, measures or whatever you want to call them. So he does not want a real dialogue. He cannot talk. He does not want to talk with people who disagree with him or who oppose him or who have a different view from what he's doing. So for the last 10 months, now let's talk about the US role and the European Union role. For the last 10 months, the US has been trying to convince Qais Said to change course and urging him to restore democracy and respecting the constitution. But so far, he's not listening. I mean, it's obvious that all these calls, all these appeals have fallen on deaf ear, and he does not listen. He's moving forward with imposing his vision and his new constitution, and he's not listening to anybody. And I think it's time for the US to really move, it's time for clarity. It's time for a strong and clear position, not an ambiguous position like the one we've had for 10 months, where, yeah, we're not calling it a coup. We're urging the president to restore democracy, whatever that means, because in his views, implementing a Gaddafi-style democracy without any political parties, even without a real parliament, with local committees, that is the way to build a real democracy. He does not believe in representative democracy, so he thinks that he's implementing a real democracy. So these calls, is really, we've wasted already 10 months, and Tunisia cannot continue on this path. It's a very dangerous path. We've wasted 10 months. We can't afford to waste another 10 months, because I think the state will not survive, and maybe Tunisia as a country will not survive if we continue down this path for another 10 months. So what do I propose? I think the United States needs to take a very clear, unambiguous position against this coup. First, by declaring it that it was indeed a coup. That maybe it was not clear after July 25, but now it's clear. The picture is clear. This is a symbolic gesture, but it will send a very, very strong message to Tunisians inside Tunisia and to the international community that this, what happened, is a coup and must be opposed and rejected and not acceptable. So I think this is very important, that we must declare that what happened is a coup and it will not be accepted or tolerated. Secondly, I think that the US and the EU should announce that any further assistance from the United States will be conditional on Tunisia's reinstating real democracy. I'm not advocating cutting aid. I'm Tunisian. I think I've been advocating for 10 years more assistance and more aid to Tunisia, both economic and military. I think Tunisia needs and deserves more assistance, both economic and military, but it has to be conditional. We cannot give any money, military or economic, to a dictatorship or to a coup. That I think is wrong. We must say this will be conditional, and the conditions must be very clear, very specific. You have to restore the parliament. You have to stop this referendum. You have to go back to real and free and fair elections for a new parliament. The conditions have to be very clear. I think the US should also announce that it will oppose any new loans by the IMF. And this is really the big stick. This is the biggest stick of them all, because Tunisia needs the IMF loan desperately to survive, especially for the government to survive or to pay the salaries of the people. Tunisia and the coup and the government cannot survive without the IMF loan. And I think not in addition to the economic conditions, there has to be political conditions. You must have an elected parliament that approves these policies, that approves these reforms. It must be democratically elected, and it must be democratically acceptable to the Tunisian people, not by a dictator who then can do whatever he wants with that money without any checks and balances. If you give $5 billion to this government, there is no way to control where that money is going to go or how it's going to be spent. There is no control whatsoever. So I think that has to be also on the table, that the conditions for the IMF loan include free and fair elections for a parliament and going back to democracy. Number 4, I would say visit and meet and invite leaders of the opposition parties. For the last 10 months, many US officials have gone to Tunis. Many European officials have gone to Tunis, and they meet only with the government, or they meet only with the president, as if he's the only legitimate person in Tunisia. This is wrong and unacceptable. We must meet with the opposition, because they are also, and especially with the parliament. The parliament has the same legitimacy that the president does. So we must meet with the leaders of the opposition. We must invite them here to Washington or to Brussels, and we must support them. And finally, we must demand that the Tunisian army stays out of politics. It's totally unacceptable for the Tunisian army to close down the parliament, to use military tanks to close down the parliament. This is totally unacceptable, and we must demand that the Tunisian army stays out of politics. As you know, all Tunisians are proud of our army, but especially we are proud of our army because it has stayed out of politics since independence, since 1956. It has a very strong culture of not being involved in political matters or political disputes. And that's the best way for the army to remain really a Republican army. So these, I think many people argue that Qais Said needs an off-ramp to get off the terrible and dangerous path that he's on. I doubt very much that he will listen to advice from anyone, but we should offer him an off-ramp. The off-ramp is if he wants to save himself and save his country, if he wants to get the IMF loan, which Tunisia desperately needs, if he wants to maintain or even increase the economic and military assistance and support that Tunisia needs and deserves, and then he must reverse course. That's the off-ramp. He must stop this nonsense, and then he can be rewarded with the IMF loan, with the increased assistance, with possibly inviting him to Washington, D.C. to attend maybe the Democracy Summit, at the end of the year. So there will be increased support, economic and military support to Tunisia. The U.S. needs Tunisia to succeed, and the U.S. will invest in Tunisia's success, but only if he cancels immediately the referendum, which has been scheduled for July 25. He reinstates the legitimate and duly elected parliament and the electoral commission, the EZ, and the High Judicial Council. These were elected by Tunisians, and call for early parliamentary elections within 90 days. And finally, start an inclusive national dialogue with all political parties. If he does these three things, he can be rewarded with several things, and he can continue to stay in power. Nobody is insisting that he has to be removed. I voted for Qais Said, but what he's doing is wrong. What he's doing has to be stopped. If he wants to stay as president, he has to respect the constitution. Finally, I would like to say that I disagree that the opposition is not united. I really don't think it's fair to ask the opposition to tell us what they're gonna do after the coup is ended. Because yes, of course, they are divided on what's going to happen afterwards. That's why we have elections. That's why we have a parliament. That's why we have a national dialogue that might take months and months. Of course, opposition is divided. It's like asking the Democratic Party and the Republican Party here to agree on what they're gonna do, after the election, or even before the elections happen. Of course they don't, but they are united against the coup. Everybody now is against the coup. They are united against the referendum. Everybody now is against the referendum. They are united for an independent EZ. They are united for the independence of the judiciary. They are independent for united for free and fair elections. So they are united in many ways. But what happens after the coup is ended and democracy is restored, of course, that has to be the outcome of a national dialogue and the outcome of elections and the outcome of a new parliament that will make decisions. They cannot make decisions now, even during the coup. So to conclude, I think the Tunisian people are now more united than ever and determined to fight against this new dictatorship and to restore and consolidate democracy. We lived in a democratic system for 10 years, and a majority of Tunisians are not willing to give up on democracy. It was not a perfect democracy. That is true. Nobody claims that it was a perfect democracy. In fact, that doesn't exist. There is no such thing as a perfect democracy. Democracy is always work in progress. But we had many weaknesses because we are a nascent democracy. We're still fighting to build a real democracy. It was still work in progress. But the Tunisians cannot do it alone. The Tunisians need strong support from the international community. The Tunisians need strong opposition to the coup from the international community and specifically from the United States and the European Union. We need to take a firm position and we need to help Tunisia return to democracy. And if the Biden administration really wants to support democracy in the world, as it claims, to oppose dictatorships in the world, I think the best place to start that is in Tunisia. The easiest place, let me say, the easiest place. I mean, there are many other places, but the easiest place where we can really make a difference with minimum cost is Tunisia. And Tunisia has the best, still has the best chance of success of a really democratic system that includes everybody, where differences can be resolved through dialogue and through free and fair elections. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Radwan, for those remarks. Obviously, I understand you feel passionately about this. I certainly don't blame you.
I do that.
Country. We in the United States, and that includes you too, of course, Radwan, at the same time, we feel passionately about the problems of democracy in our own country. So I understand both your insights and emotions. There are a lot of really interesting questions, and I'm going to try to package a few of them here. And this, to start off with, is a question, I think, for Ambassador Wallace. A number of questions have come in asking about, from very different perspectives, by the way, but they land ultimately on the same sort of issue, why the United States should care, or really does it really care, about democracy in Tunisia, given the fact that the U.S., in terms of our alliances and our friends in the Middle East, they are largely autocratic regimes. This stands in contrast with the message that we are sending out about the fight and struggle in Ukraine. There it seems to be about ideals. In the Middle East, U.S. policy seems to be about the perception of power, however one perceives this. So how do we sort of wrestle with this? What's the argument that either the United States is being hypocritical and or that the U.S. simply sees itself as having a different set of interests, and perhaps Tunisia has been caught up in that particular debate? So I'd be grateful to hear from Ambassador Wallace about that, and then we'll go on to other questions that are in our list.
Well, thanks. I mean, that's a great question, and it gets to the question of how you balance interests versus values, how you balance objectives against means. And I think in this case, and I alluded to this in my earlier remarks, I think there's an interplay between what the U.S. is trying to accomplish in Tunisia, which is to promote democracy, which I think conforms with our values and is something that we certainly want to achieve. And that butts up against our ability to influence events. And I think particularly in the context of the Arab Spring, where we saw what happened in Syria, we saw what happened in Yemen, we saw what happened in Libya, where each in different ways, the U.S. tried to get involved and tried to promote a more progressive outcome. And our involvement, I don't think, in those situations was productive. I don't think we produced the outcome that we were trying to achieve. All the means that we employed in Syria to try to produce an alternative to the Assad regime failed. And I don't want to get into a long debate about what happened in Syria or Libya or Yemen, but I think that's the crux of the issue, that if we are to try to get involved in Tunisia and to shift Tunisia into a more democratic pathway, how can we do that? In my view, employing sanctions, employing reductions in assistance or cuts to assistance, being more forthright about our objectives and our support for democracy, all that is legitimate in my view. But to be effective, as I said in my opening remarks, it has to be predicated on a Tunisian alternative to Kais Saied. And that's why the importance of unity of the opposition is an important factor. I agree that Kais Saied is not listening to the outside parties. Certainly not, and I think if we were being more clear about our objectives, I don't think that would influence him in any particular direction. What it could do, however, is it could galvanize the opposition to become more united. This interplay between the inside and the outside works in both directions. While the outside parties need the Tunisians to come up with an alternative, the Tunisians need the outside parties to indicate that they're prepared to support an alternative if it comes about. So it works in both directions. And that's one area where I would fault the United States and the international community for not signaling either directly or indirectly to the Tunisian opposition that they're prepared to support an alternative to case sign. That's where I think we could be more clear.
Thank you. That's an extremely insightful sort of remark. It is a two-way street, and what the United States does or does not do can influence, open or constrain the space for a more united opposition. And I think that's something that we often don't sort of recognize. That it's this dynamic and goes both ways. So I really do appreciate that observation. I am wondering, in regards to the kind of list of measures that Radwan has suggested that the United States take, and I would be happy to hear from anybody here, but maybe Monica, what do you think the chances are that they could have an unintended consequence of playing into the hands of Said? What's the outer limit of in terms of twisting arms for the U.S. and its Western allies in terms of getting the president to, or trying to get the president to sort of do the kinds of things that Radwan has listed as absolutely necessary for restoring democracy? Because you had mentioned in your presentation the uncanny capacity of the president, despite his lack of popularity, to manipulate statements and so on, positive statements, but also negative statements in his favor. So any thoughts on that?
The other country besides Tunisia where I've spent most of my adult life is Turkey. And very often, although Kais Saied and Recep Tayyip Erdogan hate each other and like to think they have nothing in common, I've often been reminded of how much they have in common, because they're two strongmen dictatorial populists. The difference, of course, is that Erdogan, came to power with, a more democratic movement behind him. He went a lot more gradually, and he's not proposing, the Gaddafist radical reinventions of the political system that Said is. But, I mentioned that comparison because to answer your question, Dan, I think both men groove off of. They love making politics, making domestic politics a dichotomous competition between the good of the nation and the will of the people on one hand, these populist ideals, versus what the dark outside shadowy forces want. In Turkish, Erdogan is constantly talking about the Carnegie chair, the dark forces, the shadowy powers. So to the extent that the United States creates a situation in Tunisia where Said can more easily paint himself as a victimized sovereigntist, Arab nationalist, third worldist kind of martyr, against the United States imperialistic, neo-colonial power, interventionist power, to the extent that he can paint himself as the manifestation of the pure, beautiful will of the Tunisian people versus, this monstrous, aggressive United States, he's winning. So we don't want to play into his hand in that way, because that's the fuel of his machine. He's a strange one. He's very odd in a lot of ways. He's much less your garden variety dictator than somebody, personality like Erdogan, but he's your archetypical populist autocrat, at his core. So we don't want to play into that. I'm much more of a field person than a policy person. So I approach conversations about policy recommendations with a lot of humility and respect in face of the complexities. In terms of slamming hard on the lever and cutting off, all of the aid that we can, there are some real positives and negatives. Positives, like Radwan pointed out, are clarity and cohesion of our message, the moral clarity. That's great. It's easily understandable that, clearly does a lot to empower the opposition. I think another positive is that it doesn't green light the Gulf to give more assistance. One of the questions that a lot of people have wondered, certainly myself included, since July 25th, is why countries in the Gulf, such as the UAE, where I live, didn't provide more assistance to Kais Saied immediately. there was a lot of surprise that they didn't. And I think one of the reasons why they haven't is because they're not sure yet whether Kais Saied is an agent of chaos, more of an agent of chaos versus a potential ally for them, number one. And number two, I think, there are a few factors, but I'll only list a couple. I think another factor is that they haven't seen the IMF give Tunisia a loan yet. So when if and when the IMF does give Tunisia a loan, I think that's going to be perceived by Gulf actors, including Saudi and the UAE, as a green light for them to give more assistance too. So, that can have some really deleterious knock-on effects. The negatives, there are a lot of negatives to consider here too, in terms of slamming down hard on this lever. Tunisia is in a disastrous humanitarian condition. A lot of people can't afford the bare necessities, staple foods. There are also real security interests that the US and EU have in Tunisia in terms of preventing violent extremism and migration. And that's likely to get worse under Kais Saied. I think it's important to point out that empowering Kais Saied doesn't necessarily create stability on those issues either, because Kais Saied, is this kind of wannabe Gaddafist sort of figure. He doesn't have any semblance of an economic plan. He's not dialoguing with anyone. The UGTT is calling a general strike. It's a giant mess. It's a huge conflagration. Another question that ties into this in terms of the column of negatives is whether it's going to create more instability and more of a giant conflagration to use that lever of slamming down, cutting off all aid to force him out of power. Could what comes after him be worse? I don't know. You can make a cogent case that both are possible, that slamming down on that lever could actually empower a more credible, sane opposition, and that what comes next could be better. And it plays into the type of opposition that Radwan was discussing. Or, you can make the case that what will come next is an even worse humanitarian catastrophe, and potentially a coup on top of a coup coming from inside the Ministry of Interior or something, Mali style. That's just horrific. I don't know. What I can do as more of a field person is help people who do know a lot more about policy think carefully through these different positives and negatives.
Well, thank you very much. It's sort of two questions, one from above in terms of the state, one from below. Bill Lawrence asks, why isn't there more response from Tunisians? Why are Tunisians so seemingly passive? Particularly, why aren't there more protests? Quite apart from the UGTT, where do Tunisians stand in this? One doesn't get a sense of that from the bottom up. There's other than unhappiness and perhaps despair, which may explain a lot of what you're saying, why Tunisians are not reacting more proactively. And then from the top, and this is for anybody, but I'd especially like to hear from Ambassador Wallace on this. Radwan mentioned the famous issue of the military, and we all know that the military has often been seen, and I've written about this, as a kind of exceptional player in Tunisian politics in regards to the wider region. But it's easy to sort of romanticize that exceptionalism and to ignore that there have been long-standing and complicated relationships between military leaders and the state that suggest that maybe it's not quite as exceptional as it might be seen. But having said all that, I wonder what Ambassador Wallace feels about in terms of where the military is going, and particularly given the important relationships between the Tunisian military and the U.S. military, the long-standing training programs, the aid, and so on, which one would assume might provide some sort of leverage. But it is a kind of special relationship, is it not? And yet we see the president of Tunisia trying to sort of politically seduce military leaders into his camp and having all these picture ops with various military leaders. And it's dismaying, but I just wonder whether this indicates that the military is fundamentally now on his side, or can we, as it might have been suggested before, selectively sanction certain military leaders and still keep the military on our side. So this is a big questions to think about, I recognize, but I'd be happy to start with, let's start with the military, Ambassador Wallace, if we can, because you've obviously had experience in Tunisia. And we're just, many of us who sort of work on this question are wondering where that piece of the puzzle is going.
Sure. Historically, the military in Tunisia has been very different than, say, for example, the military in Egypt. And that's an important contrast. And in Tunisia, going back to the early days after independence, Bourguiba wanted a small military because he didn't want the military to become a power center and threaten his rule or threaten the other institutions of the government. So historically, the Tunisian military has been very small. By tradition, it stayed out of politics. And that was the case during the revolution in 2011, where they basically stood back and let events happen. And when popular opposition to the government reached a turning point, they did not step in to protect Ben Ali. They basically told Ben Ali, it's time to get on a plane and go. And in the years afterwards, the military basically remained loyal to that tradition of staying out of politics. So it's interesting in the past year to see the beginnings of perhaps a change in the military and a greater willingness on the part of the military to get involved and to be a supporter of the president. Although I would say at this point, it's not entirely clear to me which way the military is going. I think they're basically hedging their bets as well, looking to see how the international community reacts, looking to see how the political opposition to Tunisia, whether they can come together and form an alternative or not. So I think that's a big open question as to what the military will end up doing. Dan, you mentioned the U.S. relationship with the military, and that is important. The U.S. has a tradition of training Tunisian military officers, which goes back before the revolution. It continued in the past decade, and in fact increased quite a bit. And it's gotten closer as we've cooperated more with Tunisia on counterterrorism, in which the Army plays a big role along the borders with Algeria and the borders with Libya. So in terms of what the U.S. can do, again, it's a multifaceted problem. It's something that might involve, speaking out more clearly, it might involve sanctions, it might involve reductions in assistance, but it also includes messaging, including messaging to the military. And I would hope that the administration is doing more behind the scenes and quietly to pass the message through military channels as well, that the military should stick to their tradition of staying out of politics and not succumb to the possibility of getting involved in a situation. While I've got the mic, let me just add one additional point. Sure. Aside from the military, in terms of U.S. messaging, one of the things the U.S. is suffering from at the moment is the lack of an ambassador on the ground in Tunisia. Don Bloom finished up his assignment there about 2 months ago. President Biden has just nominated a new ambassador, a career diplomat, but the process of getting an ambassador confirmed these days takes quite a while. So at this really critical moment in this Tunisian crisis, the U.S. does not have an ambassador on the ground, and that's unfortunate because not just what we say, but what we do on the ground is watched very closely, and it sends signals to people. When I was there, I was very active in going around and meeting with both government officials, but also civil society, leaders of all the different political parties, from the left to the right, Islamists, non-Islamists. And it wasn't so much what I was saying to them; it was just the fact that there was the visibility of the American ambassador going around and talking to these people that put pressure on them to find a compromise and a way out of the crisis. And it was not just me; it was the French ambassador, the British ambassador, and everyone seemed to get into the game. And that created a dynamic where Tunisian parties felt they needed to find a solution on their own, and that was a positive development. That's been lacking over the past year, and it's particularly a problem now with the lack of a U.S. ambassador on the ground. So I hope that can be rectified soon, and the Senate will confirm the new ambassador and get him on the ground where we can have an impact again.
Thank you very much. Another reminder, very importantly, that what the U.S. does or does not do has an impact on the capacity of Tunisian leaders and the motivation to actually sort of band together and create some sort of more unified front, depending on how one judges that effort so far. So that's, I think, very important. And to get back to this issue, I'm just going to piggyback for a moment on the reference to Bill Lawrence's question on sort of the reaction of the wider populace, perhaps the absence. I mean, it's not difficult to have a major protest in downtown Tunis, right, and get people there. So what that means nationally, one has to be very careful about when you get folks downtown, and even if they're blocked, they manage to sort of show up in numbers that can look impressive, but it's not always clear what that means. But I do wonder, and again, and this is to answer yet or engage with yet another two questions that we've received so far, and that is on this question of economic reform. It's not just a matter of getting the IMF loan; it's a matter of enacting the conditions that are set for this loan, all of which could, from the point of view of the most vulnerable populations in Tunisia, impose real hardships. So, you know, that's a contradiction or a tension in the situation that surely is on the mind of the president. If he would sort of, who has this kind of populist, quasi-Arab nationalist kind of perspective, it's something that he shares with the UJT as well. And so, are there, you know, politicians out there or who sort of are articulating their position on these sorts of austerity measures? Where do they come down? Or is this just an issue that everybody is ducking, and that is sort of not really one that people want to, and not simply the president, but also other opposition leaders really want to address because of the political implications for their own popularity if they would embrace these sorts of measures? So Radwan and Monica, maybe you want to, starting with Radwan, sort of address that question, and then Monica, because I think the economic equation is very complicated here.
Well, I think then that, of course, the economic situation is really bad, and the economic reforms that have to take place will be painful, will be hard, but they are necessary. And I think most Tunisians understand that we do have to implement some serious reforms. However, what we are looking for, what Tunisians are looking for, is for these austerity measures to be implemented fairly, to be implemented in a fair way, so that not certain people, meaning especially the poor ones, the ones who do not even have, what to eat, those, deserve more support from the government. If they are already barely surviving and barely finding what to eat, we cannot ask them to do more. They already are at the bottom. They already are barely surviving. So there is a question of social justice, of social equity. How do we implement these reforms in a fair and balanced way so that those who can afford it can pay more of the share, can afford to assume more of the responsibility? How do we establish this social justice in Tunisia is a big question. And really, this is the biggest demand of the Tunisians. And this is why they've been upset with the last 10 years, including the last 10 months. Where is the social justice? The rich have been getting richer in Tunisia, while the poor is getting poorer in Tunisia. So to agree on a package, first of all, the IMF cannot impose the package. Neither can Qais Said impose those solutions. Neither will the UJTT necessarily go along if they are not the outcome of a dialogue, of a real national dialogue, and of a parliament that represents all the Tunisians, where there is real give and take and real discussions about how do we implement these reforms in a fair and balanced way. So again, I think, yes, the economy is in trouble. Economic hardship is coming and is probably increasing in the next year or two. But there is a way to overcome these problems. It's by national unity, it's by dialogue, it's by not by dictatorship. But let me add another point, Dan. Tunisia is not Libya. Tunisia is not Syria. And Tunisia is not Yemen. we have to understand that there are major differences between Tunisia and these countries, with my total respect for these countries. But these countries have been under dictatorship for 50 years. They don't have political parties. They don't have a strong civil society. They don't have strong institutions like we do in Tunisia. We have been fighting for democracy for 40 years. This is not new. And also Tunisia is much more pro-Western. The military cannot afford to lose its ties with the US military. It's not an option for the US military to go to Russia or to go to China and say, hey, let's change everything and we're gonna work with China. But not only the military, the economy, the Tunisian economy is built on cooperation with the European Union and with the West. That's where we import most of our technology. That's where we have most of our students. That's where we have most of our exchanges, cultural, economic, political. Tunisia is pro-Western. We have had, since independence, strong relationship with the United States and with the European Union. There is a tiny minority in Tunisia, maybe 10% maximum, of radical leftists and Arab nationalists who want to change that and want Tunisia to be aligned with China or with Russia. But I guarantee you that overwhelming majority of Tunisians, 80 to 90% of Tunisians, want Tunisia to remain pro-Western and want Tunisia to remain democratic. And I think that the protests are there, Dan. I mean, just May 15th, 2 weeks ago, there was almost 30,000 people in the streets in Habib Bourguiba Avenue. By the way, that's almost equal to the number of people who were in the streets of Habib Bourguiba on January 14th, 2011, when Ben Ali escaped. So it's a large number in a small country like Tunisia to have 30,000 people in the streets at one time in one place. By contrast, Qais Said.
We only have a couple more minutes left, so we need to move on to some other.
Okay. Right. Okay. Sure.
Thank you very much. I think that's it's a point well taken. It's not easy. The science of of deducing what crowds mean politically is a complicated one. But Monica, I'm going to circle back, and then again, this is sort of trying to incorporate some questions that are coming through, and that is, but you're out there in the Gulf, and so you're well placed maybe to sort of address this issue, and that is sort of, and you raised it briefly, and it's been raised earlier, the attitude of Gulf states, and they're not all the same. Qatar's position may be different from UAE. I wouldn't be surprised to some extent by that. But particularly in terms of the economic reform agenda, I mean, one can imagine that the United Arab Emirates might be able or willing to sort of help cushion some of the effects of austerity measures, but would expect a certain kind of political payback for that, and is holding back the leverage it might otherwise have under those situations. So sort of where does the capacity, particularly given where oil prices are, for a country like UAE to make a positive difference, or the opposite? And then there's the related question, because this is often raised by Islamist leaders and folks that represent Islamist parties in Tunisia, and that is the extent to which the sort of Islamist equation affects the foreign policy of Gulf states, and the broader question, which we can't really wrestle with at all because we have all of 4 minutes left, and that is sort of the future of political Islam in Tunisia itself. So there's a lot to go on there. Monica,
what are you doing to me, Dan?
You've got 2 minutes, and then any other comments from our
great, awesome.
I'm so sorry, that's not fair.
No. All right, let's dive in.
Distill it for us.
So I think there are 4 main reasons why the UAE, in particular, hasn't bailed out Qais's dictatorship yet, as far as we know. First of all, as I said, they're not sure whether he's more of an agent of chaos as opposed to a potential ally. He's a real weirdo. He's not your normal type of dictator who actually dialogues with and butters up potential bankrollers. He doesn't seem to really understand how to communicate with people who are or were in his corner. You know, you've seen it domestically in Tunisia with him walling off people who were cheerleading July 25th. You know, UGTT was begging for a phone call, begging to be at his table of dictatorial consolidation, really. But now they're holding a strike this month. So, you know, you've seen that there. And my my guess is that he's doing something very similar in terms of faulty, problematic communication with would-be bankrollers in the Gulf. A second factor, the UAE has recognized that it's been overextended in Yemen, in Libya, in its MENA policy in general. And there's been, if not a thoroughgoing auto-critique or self-reflection, at least a recognition of that. So, that makes them maybe a little bit less likely to jump in, especially if they're unsure whether somebody is going to be an ally who's going to work with them on their goals. I think a third factor is the perceived failure of political Islam region-wide, I think, which makes the UAE relax a little bit more. They don't think that they're in a situation, like we were in 10 years ago, where from the UAE's perspective, this is a faulty perspective because Ennahda is very much its own actor. And I don't, for reasons that I could give, a lot of talks about, and I don't think Ennahda is properly understood as an Islamist party even. But the UAE misunderstands Ennahda as being the local franchise, like the local McDonald's of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood or the Egyptian Ikhwan. It's a misunderstanding, but they do. So the fact that they see the Muslim Brotherhood and its cousin-like movements throughout the region as being on the back foot makes them, I think, a little bit calmer. I think a fourth factor is, as I said, that the IMF hasn't given Tunisia a deal. So the UAE and Saudi, et cetera, they don't perceive Tunisia to have been greenlit by Western players just yet. And there might be back channel dialogue coming from the United States or other Western actors trying to put some pressure. I hope there's kind of dialogue trying to put some pressure on Gulf players not to bail out Saud's dictatorship. Is it an affordable deal for the UAE and Saudi Arabia? Absolutely. It's a bargain basement dictatorship. It's a bargain basement style of government that they might perceive as being in their interests. Is it a smart deal? I'm not sure they're convinced of that yet. A few other points, gosh, I'll probably have time in like 1 or 2 minutes remaining. I agree with Radwan's point that you're not going to get a unified alternative until you have a national dialogue. You're never going to get Abir Musi's party standing side by side with Ennahda chanting for democracy against dictatorship. You won't, because Abir Musi's entire raison d'etre is being anti-Ennahda. And that's part of what you see, in democratic politics, especially in a country that was recently a dictatorship. And that's why you need a national dialogue. I also agree with Radwan's point that the United States has a lot more influence in Tunisia than it does in Syria and Libya. We're not talking about a US military intervention in Tunisia at all. We're simply talking about good, healthy diplomatic messaging that's in the United States' interests and also respects Tunisian sovereignty. I think Tunisia is a rare case where the United States' interests, values, and influence are well aligned. I think I'm running out of time a bit, but there were so many things more that I wanted to say to answer Lorenzo's question about why Ennahda has declined, to answer Jill's question more about why this perceived passivity from Tunisians who I think are broadly exhausted, and they just don't yet see a clear vision for the future. And also protesting, honestly, it's hard. In Tunisia, there are a lot of people who are afraid. Fear has really come back. When I tried interviewing Tunisians, I succeeded in the month after the coup. There was a ton of fear, the likes of which I hadn't encountered since my first trip to Tunisia all the way back in 2007. I had people who said, Monica, I've spoken with you for the past decade, but I don't want to talk unless I'm inside my own home with the curtains drawn or we're in a moving vehicle. There was a mass migration to Signal away from away from WhatsApp and Facebook, because that was perceived to be more safe. There is a return of fear, and there's a lot of exhaustion, a lot of economic desperation and frustration with political parties for not having worked effectively to deliver on those goals, which, if you study democratic transitions, it's very typical, to have these flaws and fractures in a young democracy. But I think obviously most Tunisians aren't feeling that. They're feeling their pocketbooks, they're feeling their kitchen tables, and they're enormously frustrated. They got so frustrated that by July 25th, they said, we're willing to burn the whole house down rather than invest more in fixing all the problems with plumbing that we didn't imagine would have existed when we embarked on this project to build a democratic house. I'll conclude lastly just by stressing how important Tunisia is symbolically and strategically. I think for the United States, for liberal democracies in general, and for the project of freedom in the Arab world. There is not another country I can think of that packs so far above its weight in terms of its importance and its inspirational potential for other countries in the Arab world and more broadly speaking too. It's easy to ignore Tunisia. I think we've often ignored it over the past decade. We've assumed that its transition is on track. Oh, they had 3 free and fair elections, whatever. Libya's a conflagration, Yemen's a conflagration. Tunisia's doing okay. Democracy is the only game in town. That obviously wasn't the case. And as I and many others were drumbeating, Tunisia had real problems. The absence of economic progress, security sector reform, creating a constitutional court. But I think we turn away now as then at our own peril. The stakes are very, very high and Tunisia matters. So thanks to everybody who came today and who's watching.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that thanks as well, and also your message, which is the consequences of failure in Tunisia will extend far beyond the borders of that country. And so there's a lot of basic interests at stake. I think you can make an interest-based argument, quite apart from principle, for addressing the question of democracy in Tunisia that should not be off the table as well. So thanks to our amazing participants. I really do think this was a superb discussion, and I'm glad that the Arab Center has held this meeting, but also will be able to post the discussion on its webpage so other folks can benefit from listening and watching this discussion. So thanks very much to everyone.